Imagine this. The year is 1453. The walls of Constantinople, proud and unbroken for 1,000 years, tremble beneath the roar of cannon fire. Smoke rises, churches toll their bells in desperation, and terrified citizens kneel in prayer as the ground itself shakes. And then, from the hills beyond, a banner is raised, a crescent moon on a red field. The army of the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed the Conqueror, has breached the city. In that moment, the medieval world ends, and a new chapter of history begins. But this is not the beginning of the Ottoman story. It is merely the thunderclap of a storm that had been gathering for over a century. To truly understand how an obscure band of frontier warriors grew into one of the most powerful empires in human history, we must travel back to the dusty borderlands of Anatolia, at the very edge of the crumbling Byzantine world. This is the story of the Ottoman Empire, its rise, its glory, and its fall. A world in chaos. The 13th century was an age of upheaval. The Byzantine Empire, once the heir of Rome, was staggering under corruption, invasions, and civil wars. Crusaders had sacked Constantinople in 1204, leaving it broken and impoverished. To the east, the Mongols thundered across Asia, burning cities and toppling kingdoms. Anatolia, the heartland of modern Turkey, was caught in the middle. Here, the once mighty Seljuk Turks were collapsing under Mongol pressure. Into this chaos poured countless small Turkic clans, nomadic warriors and refugees looking for new lands to settle. They were tough, hungry, and restless. Many became Ghazis, warriors of faith, raiding Byzantine lands in the name of Islam. Yet they were not organized kingdoms, only tribal bands led by ambitious chieftains. Among them was a man named Ertugrul, chief of a small tribe called the Kai, part of the Oghuz Turks. He and his followers wandered westward, looking for safety, opportunity, and destiny. Ertugrul's son was Osman, born around 1258. History remembers him as Osman I, the founder of the Ottoman dynasty. Osman was not born into wealth or power. His tribe was small, numbering perhaps a few hundred tents, surviving in the shadow of stronger neighbors. Yet Osman was ambitious. He understood that the Byzantine frontier was weak, its fortresses poorly defended, its rulers divided. And legend says Osman had a dream. In this dream, he saw a mighty tree grow from his chest. Its branches stretched across the world, shading mountains and rivers, and from its roots flowed waters that nourished all lands. When he awoke, Osman told a holy man of this vision. The holy man interpreted it. Osman's descendants would rule a vast empire, spreading justice and power across the world. Whether this dream truly happened or was invented later by Ottoman chroniclers, it became the myth of origin, the spiritual prophecy of a dynasty that would last for 6 centuries. Osman wasted no time making the dream real. He began raiding Byzantine fortresses, testing his warriors in battle. In 1299, he declared independence from the weakening Seljuks. That year is remembered as the birth of the Ottoman Empire. The first conquests. Osman's warriors were fierce, but few. They fought not with grand armies, but with speed, surprise, and zeal. Their horses carried them swiftly across the rugged frontier, and their faith gave them unity. The Byzantines underestimated him. To them, Osman was just another petty chieftain. But little by little, fortress by fortress, he carved out a principality. His most famous victory was the capture of Bilsik, a strategic fortress, through cunning rather than brute force. The Ottomans often used diplomacy as much as warfare. Local Christians who surrendered were often allowed to keep their lands and practice their faith, as long as they paid tribute. This pragmatic tolerance helped Osman win allies where others might have faced rebellion. When Osman died around 1323, he left his son Orhan not just a tribe, but the foundation of a state. Orhan and the birth of a state. Orhan was more than a warrior. He was a builder. In 1326, he captured Bursa, a rich Byzantine city. This was a turning point. Bursa became the Ottomans' first real capital, transforming them from wandering horsemen into rulers of cities. Orhan minted coins, built mosques, and organized an administration. The Ottomans also innovated militarily. Orhan created a new force unlike any in Europe, the Janissaries. These were not tribal warriors. But professional soldiers, boys taken from Christian families through the Devshirme system, converted to Islam, but trained with absolute loyalty to the Sultan. This controversial system would later become one of the empire's greatest strengths, and also one of its weaknesses. By the mid-14th century, the Ottomans were no longer just raiders. They were rulers with cities, armies, and vision, and Europe was about to feel their presence like never before. In 1354, a massive earthquake struck the Gallipoli Peninsula. Byzantine fortresses crumbled, walls cracked, and chaos reigned. The Ottomans seized the chance. Orhan's son, Suleiman Pasha, marched in and occupied Gallipoli, establishing the Ottomans' first foothold in Europe. This was more than conquest, it was destiny. The Ottomans were no longer just Anatolian warlords. They were now a power straddling two continents, poised to challenge both East and West. From Gallipoli, they expanded into Thrace and the Balkans. By the time of Orhan's death, the once small tribe of the Kei had become a rising empire. By the late 14th century, the Ottoman star was rising, and Byzantium's was falling. Constantinople, the once glorious capital of the Roman emperors, was a shadow of itself, reduced to a few neighborhoods, surrounded by enemies, its emperors begging Europe for aid. The stage was set for a clash that would decide the fate of empires. But first, the Ottomans would face their greatest test yet, a storm from the east, fiercer than any they had known. When Orhan died in 1362, the mantle of leadership fell to his son Murad I. If Osman had been the dreamer and Orhan the builder, then Murad was the warrior who would transform the Ottomans into a continental power. Murad inherited an empire on two continents, Anatolia in the east and Thrace in the west. He set his eyes firmly on the Balkans, where the fractured kingdoms of Serbia, Bulgaria, where Wallachia lay vulnerable. But to truly rise, Murad needed more than raids. He needed legitimacy. And he found it by taking the ancient Byzantine city of Adrianople in 1369. Adrianople, today known as Edirne, became the new Ottoman capital. From here, Murad could look both east and west, commanding the crossroads of Europe and Asia. It was a symbolic shift. The Ottomans were no longer outsiders nibbling at Byzantium's edges. They were now a permanent presence in Europe. Murad also perfected one of the Ottomans' most famous and infamous institutions, the Devshirme. Every few years, Ottoman officials would tour Christian villages in the Balkans, selecting young boys, sometimes with parental consent, often without. These boys were taken from their homes, converted to Islam, and trained for service. The brightest became administrators and viziers. The strongest became soldiers in the Janissary Corps. The Janissaries were unlike any military force in Europe. They were disciplined, professional, and completely loyal to the Sultan. They had no tribal ties, no aristocratic privilege, no wealth of their own, only the empire to serve. For centuries, they would be the steel backbone of Ottoman power, feared across battlefields from Hungary to Persia. But in their beginnings under Murad, they were simply a revolutionary idea, the first standing infantry in Europe since the Roman legions. The Ottomans' rise in the Balkans alarmed the Christian kingdoms. Alliances formed against them, and in 1389, everything came to a head at Kosovo Field. Here, an army of Serbs, Bosnians, and Albanians met Murad's forces. The battle was brutal, a clash of knights and cavalry, arrows and swords, thundering hooves, and desperate cries. Though the Ottomans won, it came at a terrible price. Sultan Murad himself was killed, legend says, by a Serbian knight, Miloš Obilić, who infiltrated the Ottoman camp and struck him down. But Murad's death did not weaken the Ottomans. Instead, it became a rallying cry. His son, Bayezid I, was immediately crowned on the battlefield, earning the name Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, for the speed of his actions and campaigns. The Balkans, though bloodied, were now firmly under Ottoman shadow. Bayezid I ruled like a storm. He struck swiftly and decisively, defeating both Christian coalitions and rival Turkish beyliks in Anatolia. His army swept as far as Hungary, while in the east he subdued rebellious neighbors. He was the first Ottoman ruler to adopt the title of Sultan of Rome, claiming to be the heir of the old Seljuk sultans and, by extension, a protector of the Islamic world. But Bayezid's ambition outpaced his resources. He besieged Constantinople itself in 1394, nearly ending the Byzantine Empire once and for all. Only aid from Europe saved the city temporarily. By 1402, Bayezid was at the height of his power, commanding one of the largest armies in the known world. But just as he prepared to extinguish Byzantium forever, a new threat arose, one far deadlier than the crumbling empire of Constantinople. The invasion of Timur from the east came Timur the Lame, better known as Tamerlane, a conqueror who rivaled Genghis Khan himself. Timur had carved a path of devastation across Persia, India, and Central Asia, leaving pyramids of skulls in his wake. When Timur and Bayezid's ambitions collided, the result was inevitable: war. In 1402, the two armies met at the Battle of Ankara. It was one of the greatest clashes of the medieval world. Bayezid commanded a vast army of Ottomans and vassals, but Timur outmaneuvered him with clever strategy and treachery. Many of Bayezid's allies defected mid-battle. The Ottoman army collapsed. Bayezid himself was captured and, according to some sources, humiliated in Timur's court, kept in a gilded cage until his death. The empire, which had seemed unstoppable, now teetered on the brink of destruction. For over a decade after Bayezid's capture, the empire plunged into civil war. His sons fought bitterly for the throne, each carving out pieces of territory. The Byzantines briefly breathed easier, while Balkan rulers tried to shake off Ottoman chains. This period, known as the Ottoman Interregnum, 1402 to 1413, was perhaps the closest the empire ever came to dying in its cradle. But in the end, one of Bayezid's sons, Mehmed I, emerged victorious. He reunited the fractured state, rebuilt armies, and restored stability. The Ottomans were wounded, but they had survived. And survival meant opportunity. Murad II and the road to Constantinople. Mehmed I's son, Murad II, continued the work of rebuilding. He fought off repeated European crusades, most famously at the Battle of Varna in 1444, where a massive Christian coalition was shattered. But Murad was more than a soldier. He laid the groundwork for something greater. He trained his young son, Mehmed, not only in war but in statecraft, languages, science, and philosophy. That boy would grow into Mehmed II, one of the most brilliant and ambitious rulers in history. His destiny was clear: to finish what his ancestors had begun, to seize Constantinople, the queen of cities, and make it the heart of a new empire. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic events in all of history. When Murad II died in 1451, his son ascended the throne. He was just 19 years old. Many in Europe assumed the Ottomans would now falter under the inexperience of a boy. But this boy was no ordinary ruler. His name was Mehmed II, and history would remember him as Mehmed the Conqueror. From a young age, Mehmed had been prepared for greatness. He was fluent in multiple languages: Arabic, Persian, Greek, Latin, even some Italian. He studied philosophy, mathematics, and military science. And above all, he possessed a burning ambition: to capture the greatest prize of all, Constantinople. For over 1,000 years, the city had stood as the impregnable capital of Byzantium. It was more than a city, it was a symbol. Whoever held Constantinople controlled the gateway between Europe and Asia, the key to trade routes. And the legacy of Rome itself. Dozens of armies had tried and failed to breach its mighty walls. But Mehmed believed he was destined to succeed. In April 1453, Mehmed marched on Constantinople with an army of nearly 80,000 soldiers, janissaries, cavalry, artillery, and auxiliaries. Against him stood just 7,000 defenders, led by the Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI, bolstered by a handful of Venetian and Genoese allies. But the city's strength lay not in numbers, but in its legendary walls, a triple line of stone, ditches, but towers that had repelled invaders for centuries. Mehmed brought something new to the battlefield: cannon firepower on a scale the world had never seen. He commissioned a Hungarian engineer, Orban, to build monstrous guns capable of hurling stone balls weighing over half a ton. These great bombards pounded the walls day and night, shaking the city to its foundations. Still, Constantinople held. Week after week, assaults were repelled. Byzantine ships, chained across the Golden Horn, blocked Ottoman fleets. The defenders prayed, while Mehmed's men dug tunnels and fired ceaselessly. Finally, on May 29, 1453, Mehmed ordered the final assault. Waves of troops stormed the walls. The defenders fought desperately. Emperor Constantine himself is said to have died sword in hand, refusing to flee. At dawn, the Ottomans broke through. The crescent flag was raised above the battered walls. Constantinople had fallen. The shockwaves reverberated across the world. To Muslims, it was the triumph of Islam. To Christians, it was the end of the Eastern Roman Empire, a catastrophe mourned for centuries. For Mehmed, it was the fulfillment of destiny. He declared Constantinople the new Ottoman capital, renaming it Istanbul, and made it the beating heart of a global empire. Mehmed was more than a conqueror. He was a statesman and visionary. He repopulated Istanbul with Muslims, Christians, and Jews, turning it once again into a cosmopolitan hub. He built mosques, markets, and palaces, including the majestic Topkapi Palace, which became the seat of Ottoman power. He expanded the empire further, conquering much of Greece, Serbia, and Bosnia. His fleets challenged Venice and Genoa in the Mediterranean. Even Italy trembled when Mehmed's armies raided Otranto in 1480, just before his sudden death. At his passing, the empire stretched from the Danube to Anatolia, from the Black Sea to the Aegean. But this was only the beginning. His successors would take the Ottomans to even greater heights. After Mehmed, the empire saw ups and downs, with intrigue, assassinations, and struggles between brothers. But in 1512, a ruthless new ruler took the throne, Suleiman, known as Selim the Grim. Selim was harsh, feared, and uncompromising. He turned the empire's focus eastward, defeating the powerful Safavid Empire of Persia at the Battle of Calderon in 1514, securing Anatolia from Shirai influence. Then, in 1517, he marched into Egypt and crushed the Mamluks, the ancient warrior caste who had ruled for centuries. With this victory, Selim brought the holy cities of Mecca and Medina under Ottoman control. Even more importantly, he assumed the title of Caliph of Islam, claiming spiritual leadership over the entire Muslim world. The Ottomans were no longer just an empire. They were now the defenders of Islam's holiest sites, a superpower with both political and religious legitimacy. Selim's son would eclipse even his father's achievements. In 1520, Suleiman I ascended the throne. He would rule for 46 years. And under him, the Ottoman Empire reached the height of its power. Suleiman was known in the West as the Magnificent, and in the Islamic world as the Lawgiver, Kanuni. He was a conqueror, a reformer, and a patron of the arts, a ruler who combined military brilliance with statesmanship. Under his reign, the empire expanded further than ever before. His armies captured Belgrade in 1521, then shattered Hungary at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, leaving the kingdom in ruins. By 1529, Suleiman was at the gates of Vienna, the very heart of Europe. Though the siege failed, it marked the farthest western advance of Ottoman power. In the east, he campaigned against Persia. In the Mediterranean, his fleets, commanded by the legendary Admiral Barbarossa, dominated the seas, clashing with Spain and Venice. In North Africa, the Ottomans extended their reach as far as Algeria. At its height, the empire under Suleiman stretched from Algeria to Iraq, from Hungary to Yemen. It was, without question, one of the greatest powers on earth. Suleiman was not only a conqueror, he was a reformer. He overhauled the empire's legal system, unifying laws and balancing Islamic principles with practical governance. His reforms ensured fairness in taxation, justice in courts, and greater stability for his diverse subjects. He was also a patron of culture. Under his rule, Ottoman art, architecture, and poetry flourished. The great architect Mimar Sinan built masterpieces such as the Suleimani Mosque in Istanbul, which still dominates the skyline today. In Suleiman's time, Istanbul was the envy of the world, a city of scholars, merchants, artisans, and warriors. The empire was rich, vibrant, and feared. Yet even in this golden age, cracks were beginning to show. The empire was vast, but difficult to govern. Corruption crept into the bureaucracy, and rival European powers were growing stronger, driven by new wealth from the Americas and advances in science and technology. Still, for the moment, the Ottomans stood supreme. And Suleiman himself, majestic, wise, and powerful, became the symbol of their greatness. In 1566, after nearly half a century on the throne, Suleiman the Magnificent died during a campaign in Hungary. He left behind an empire at its zenith. Yet with his death, the golden age faded. His successors lacked his vision and discipline. Intrigue within the palace, corruption among officials, and shifting tides of global power slowly began to eat away at Ottoman strength. But that is the story of decline. For now, in the mid-16th century, the Ottomans were masters of a vast and diverse world. Their empire was the crossroads of civilizations, the superpower of its time. And yet, as history always reminds us, no empire, no matter how glorious, lasts forever. The 17th century had ended with the Ottomans still vast, still powerful, but no longer unstoppable. From the outside, it seemed like the empire was still a giant, stretching across continents. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form, cracks that would widen into chasms over the next 200 years. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Ottomans had gained a nickname whispered in the palaces of Europe, the sick man of Europe. It was a cruel but fitting label, describing an empire that was still alive, but weakened, limping, but increasingly dependent on the very powers that once feared it. At the root of the Ottoman decline was not a single disaster, but rather a slow rot from within. In earlier centuries, the empire had thrived on a disciplined system of administration. The Devshirme system that brought in capable administrators, the Timar landholding system that balanced land and loyalty, and the strict, centralized rule of sultans who commanded fear and respect. But over time, these systems decayed. The Devshirme was abandoned, replaced by nepotism and favoritism. Positions in government were sold for money rather than earned by merit. Corruption seeped into the veins of the empire. The once feared janissaries, elite warriors who had formed the backbone of Ottoman military power, became a liability. By the 18th century, many janissaries no longer trained for battle. Instead, they lived as shopkeepers, tradesmen, or even thugs, or still demanded their privileges as soldiers. They resisted reforms fiercely, even assassinating sultans who dared to modernize them. The Ottoman army, once unmatched in its organization, became obsolete in the face of Europe's rapid technological and military revolutions. While the Ottomans stagnated, Europe surged forward. The scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution reshaped Western powers into global titans. France, Britain, Austria, and later Russia developed modern armies, advanced economies, and expanding colonial empires. They no longer saw the Ottomans as a threat to Europe. Instead, they saw them as an opportunity, territory to be carved, markets to be exploited, and a crumbling giant to be manipulated. One after another, Ottoman territories began slipping away. In the late 17th century, Hungary was lost to Austria after the failed siege of Vienna. In the 18th century, Russia began expanding southward, capturing territories around the Black Sea. Catherine the Great's armies crushed the Ottomans multiple times. By the 19th century, nationalist revolts shook the Balkans. Greece won independence in the 1820s, followed by Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria. The Ottoman dream of controlling Europe had long died. Now the empire was fighting just to survive on its own borders. But decline did not come without attempts at revival. In the mid-19th century, Ottoman leaders launched a series of reforms known as the Tanzimat, or reorganization. These reforms aimed to modernize the empire's laws, administration, or military along European lines. New schools were built, military training was updated, and Western-style uniforms and weapons were adopted. The empire attempted to create equal citizenship rights for all its subjects, whether Muslim or Christian. For a moment, there was hope that the Ottomans could be reborn as a modern state. But these reforms faced resistance from both ends. Conservative Muslims saw them as an abandonment of Islamic traditions. At the same time, European powers often interfered, claiming to protect Christian minorities but really seeking to weaken Ottoman control. The reforms, though ambitious, could not stop the empire's slide. By the 19th century, the fate of the Ottoman Empire had become known in European politics as the Eastern Question. The question was simple: what will happen when the Ottoman Empire finally collapses? Britain, France, Austria, and Russia all vied for influence, each wanting to benefit from Ottoman decline, but none wanting another to dominate the region completely. The Crimean War of the 1850s was one result of this tension. Britain and France fought alongside the Ottomans, not out of friendship, but to stop Russia from seizing too much Ottoman land. The Ottomans had become a pawn in the games of European powers, surviving not through their own strength, but because Europe feared the consequences of their complete collapse. But the most dangerous threat to Ottoman survival came not from foreign armies, but from within. As the 19th century wore on, nationalism surged across Europe and into the Ottoman lands. Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, Armenians, and Arabs all began dreaming of independence or autonomy. The Ottomans, who once prided themselves on ruling over many peoples and faiths, now found themselves tearing apart from within. Revolts broke out in the Balkans, often brutally suppressed by the Ottoman military, which in turn invited European intervention. The Armenian question in the late 19th century, with demands for reform and autonomy, created more unrest and suspicion. Everywhere, the empire seemed to be bleeding. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was a shadow of its former self. Once spanning 3 continents, it now clung to Anatolia, parts of the Middle East, and a shrinking portion of the Balkans. In 1908, a revolutionary group known as the Young Turks seized power, promising to modernize and save the empire. They deposed the long-reigning Sultan Abdulhamid II and restored a constitutional government. At first, their energy seemed like it might revive Ottoman fortunes. But their aggressive policies and Turkish nationalism alienated many of the empire's remaining minority groups. Then came the empire's most fateful choice of all, entering World War I. When the Great War erupted in 1914, the Ottoman Empire saw an opportunity. Aligning with Germany and Austria-Hungary, Ottoman leaders hoped that victory would restore their lost glory and secure their survival. Instead, it sealed their fate. The empire became a battleground. Ottoman armies fought on multiple fronts, against the British in the Middle East, against the Russians in the Caucasus, and against Allied forces at Gallipoli. Though the Ottomans scored surprising victories, most famously at Gallipoli, where Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, rose to prominence, the strain of war was unbearable. Arab revolts, encouraged by the British, tore through the empire's Middle Eastern territories. Ottoman supply lines collapsed. Famine and disease ravaged the civilian population. By 1918, the Ottoman Empire was exhausted. Allied armies marched into Constantinople. The once mighty empire, which had terrified Europe for centuries, lay defeated and humiliated. The end had come. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 dismembered what remained of the empire, carving up its lands among Britain, France, Italy, and Greece. But the story did not end there. In Anatolia, a young general named Mustafa Kemal Ataturk led a nationalist resistance that defied the occupiers and abolished the Sultanate. In 1923, the Republic of Turkey was born, modern, secular, and determined to leave the Ottoman legacy behind. The Ottoman Empire, after more than 600 years of history, was no more. The story of the Ottoman Empire is more than just the tale of a dynasty, or a military machine, or even a state. It is the story of 6 centuries of human history, of ambition and glory, of brilliance and brutality, of rise and fall. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the Ottomans announced themselves as heirs of both Rome and Islam. For centuries they ruled with unmatched confidence. And when they finally collapsed after World War I, the shockwaves did not just reshape the Middle East or Europe, they reshaped the entire world order. The death of the Ottoman Empire left a power vacuum that still echoes today. The empire had ruled over a vast mosaic of peoples: Turks, Arabs, Armenians, Greeks, Kurds, Slavs, Jews. and many more. When the empire collapsed, these communities were suddenly thrust into new states, often drawn on maps by foreign powers with little regard for history or culture. In the Middle East, Britain and France carved up Ottoman lands into mandates: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan. These artificial borders planted the seeds for conflicts that continue to this day. In Anatolia, the birth of Turkey under Ataturk created a modern, secular republic, but also a nation still wrestling with the legacy of empire and identity. In the Balkans, nationalist struggles continued long after Ottoman rule ended, fueling wars throughout the 20th century. The Ottoman collapse also marked the end of a certain Islamic imperial model. For centuries, the Sultan Caliph embodied both political and spiritual authority. With the fall of the Caliphate, the Muslim world entered a new era, fragmented, searching for identity in a world increasingly dominated by Western powers. But though the empire is gone, its legacy is everywhere. In Istanbul, the Hagia Sophia, the Blue Mosque, the Topkapi Palace, monuments to the grandeur of Ottoman architecture, still awe visitors today. In law and culture, Ottoman practices shaped modern Turkey and influenced regions from North Africa to the Balkans. In language and cuisine, traces of Ottoman life remain: words, recipes, traditions that blended the cultures of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Perhaps most importantly, the Ottomans showed the world the possibilities and dangers of ruling a vast, diverse empire. For centuries, they managed to govern Christians, Muslims, and Jews under a single political order. It was not perfect. Minorities faced discrimination, revolts were suppressed, but compared to many of its European contemporaries, the Ottoman system allowed for a surprising degree of coexistence. The empire was also a cultural bridge. For Europe, the Ottomans were both a fearsome enemy and a gateway to the riches of Asia. The flow of ideas, goods, and technologies through Ottoman lands shaped the Renaissance, trade, and the birth of the modern world. Now we arrive at the great alternate history question. What if the Ottoman Empire had survived? Imagine if the Ottomans had successfully modernized during the 19th century, embracing industry, reforming their administration, and building true unity among their diverse peoples. Could they have become a modern nation-state spanning the Middle East and parts of Europe? Could Constantinople have remained a capital rivaling London or Paris, the crossroads of civilizations in the 20th century? Or imagine if they had chosen differently in World War I, staying neutral, or siding with the Allies. Would the empire have endured longer, perhaps even evolving into a federation of nations under Ottoman leadership? The truth is, the Ottoman Empire fell because it could not adapt fast enough to a world that was changing too quickly. But history is full of hinges. A single different choice, a single successful reform, could have rewritten the fate of millions. And yet, perhaps the most haunting what-if of all is this: was the fall of the Ottomans inevitable? Every empire, from Rome to Byzantium to the Ottomans, eventually reaches its twilight. The question is not whether it will fall, but how and what will rise in its place. The story of the Ottomans is a reminder of the rise and fall of human ambition. From a small Turkish principality on the frontier of Anatolia, they became the terror of Europe, the masters of Constantinople, the rulers of an empire that spanned 3 continents. They reached their zenith under Suleiman the Magnificent, when their armies threatened Vienna and their culture shone with unmatched brilliance. And then, slowly, they declined, undone not by a single defeat, but by centuries of corruption, stagnation, but the relentless rise of rivals. By the time of World War I, the empire was no longer the hunter, but the hunted. The sick man of Europe gasped its final breath, and from its ashes new nations were born. But though the empire has passed, its shadows remain, etched in the borders of nations, the tensions of the Middle East, the monuments of Istanbul, and the memory of a world once ruled by the crescent and the sword. And now, as we close this journey across 6 centuries, I ask you this: do you believe the fall of the Ottomans was inevitable? As could they have adapted and survived into our own time? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, don't forget to subscribe for more epic stories of empires, battles, and the turning points that shaped our world. Hit like if you want more alternate history explorations. And share this documentary with anyone who loves history as much as you do. History is not just the past. It's the mirror in which we see ourselves today. And the story of the Ottoman Empire reminds us that even the mightiest powers can rise and fall.